Item 15, Stage 3 Drought Update.
Thank you. Mr. Hagmark.
Madam Mayor, council members, Joshua Hagmark, Water Resources Manager, here to give another Stage 3 Drought Update. In today's discussion, we'll be going over the status of the state related to the drought, community conservation, water supply strategy, lake and reservoir operation, drought response capital projects, including a lengthy discussion on the latest with the desalination plant, an update on the recycled water plant, and water conservation program achievements. So, statewide, I think the best way to describe it is Santa Barbara County is basically the epicenter of the current drought. It basically radiates out from Santa Barbara County. But as you can see, the rest of the state, although in Northern California is doing better with some of the recent rainfall, they still are in a state of drought given some of the groundwater conditions that the area is in. And again, some of the extreme temperatures and weather that we're seeing. Community conservation for June, 36% reduction. Again, this is from 2013 production. And this brings keeps our conservation at 35% since declaring our Stage 3 drought emergency in May of 2015. Continue to bring this graphic forward. I think it's helpful to see how the community is doing in their per capita usage. Our 12-month average is now 88 gallons per capita per day. Our goal under the 20 by 2020 goal was to reduce our usage down to 117 gallons per capita per day, so we're doing remarkably well with that. Our residential usage, which you can see down here in the corner here, this is what we report to the state. It's kind of this benchmark by which they kind of compare communities. We're right now somewhere in the mid-60s gallons per capita per day. But this winter we were down around 50. The state considers 55 gallons per capita a day to be kind of basic health and safety for residential usage. So our water supply strategy, we have updated it to reflect our recent water purchase. And what you'll picture here looks pretty good in the sense that we have adequate supplies going out through 2018 to meet our needs, assuming, again, continued conservation, assuming desal operation. The one thing that isn't showing here, and I'll be bringing that back for our drought update in September, is the peaking shortage that we are anticipating for next summer. So although we have enough water, the challenge is getting all of that water here. And so there are several months in next summer where we will not have sufficient water to meet demands. And so we will be kicking off a discussion with Water Commission and Council about what options. Do we wait until next summer to do something, or wait until the spring, or potentially implement something this winter to try and allow us to store adequate water to meet those demands next summer, assuming, no rainfall. So that's kind of I think the graphic we now have to add to this. And as well, we'll be adding projections out into 2019 because I think we want to continue to have that forecast outlook. So where do we stand? Imported water, we are still waiting for the Department of Water Resources to approve our purchase. A little frustrated that it's been held up there, and there's a long story that goes with it. But in the end, we feel confident we will get the 4,000 acre feet that we purchased. It just may come with a larger returned component. They're having issues with the deal we have is for every 2 gallons we borrow, we have to return a gallon. It was an unbalanced exchange, which the state is having some issues with. I think they were okay with ours, but then there has been some more greedy arrangements out there that are even more unbalanced. And I think the state is just taking a look at that and how that complies with state water contracting rules. Conveyance limitations, as I mentioned, that we are right now basing our deliveries around 3,300 acre feet. That's what capacity we have bought in the system. Again, if other agencies are not using at capacity, we'll certainly take advantage of that, and we have been over the last several months. But as far as planning and looking forward, all the other agencies are looking to maximize their imported water going through next year, including this winter. We're going to have the state water system pretty busy making deliveries all winter long. So carryover water, best way to categorize it is the water that we've been able to save because of conservation. And the city has probably the largest chunk of carryover water remaining in the lake. It's about 2,300 acre feet, and we expect by December we'll have that exhausted. And then Cachuma's role after that will be the storage of state water to help us meet those peak needs. All winter we'll be stockpiling imported water there and then using it to help meet those peak summer demands. Groundwater, I have a little more detail later, but peak production we anticipate this year. We have all wells online, and our future planning is anticipating a decline in that production. So demand management side of it, cumulative average reduction remains at 35. We don't anticipate any more regulations coming out of the state, given that things in Northern California have improved for some agencies. As far as city regulations go, we do not anticipate the need for temporary regulations to meet this summer's peak demands. We had raised that concern with council. We weren't sure, but given we've been able to hit the conservation target and we've been able to take advantage of increased imported water deliveries, we believe we're in good standing for the rest of this year. And as I mentioned, based on continued drought conditions, though, we do anticipate an issue next summer. So as far as Lake Cachuma goes, it's now at 13.5% of capacity. The barge was successfully located on June 28th and 29th, and that was just in time for the downstream release, which began on July 12th. They will be releasing about 8,000 acre feet of water that belongs to the downstream users over a 6 to 8 week period, and the lake will drop by about 10 feet. The Hilton Creek trout, this has been an ongoing discussion back and forth for the last 18 months, and running out of options. The fish are going to remain in Hilton Creek, and right now they're being fed by trucks that are filling 5,000-gallon tanks. It's certainly a far cry from the amount of water that was being released, so we're not sure exactly how refreshing flows are going to satisfy the oxygen and temperature needs. But this is ultimately where NIMS has landed in their discussion with the Bureau. We, of course, have been encouraging them to move them to a hatchery where we can maintain the cool temperatures and certainly make sure that they survive through this drought and then bring them back. But couldn't reach agreement with NIMS on that, which is unfortunate. The Bureau is working, though, on a longer-term solution, and hopefully that will be the longer-term solution. We've had some positive movement in the accounting for evaporation. As it is now, the carryover water is being protected by this unallocated water, which I'll talk about in just a second. But what we're optimistic about is this condition 2. Once the carryover water is exhausted, the Bureau has now said that they would split the evaporation between the minimum pool and the imported water in the lake, which is significant. We've had no issue with our water taking on normal evaporation. It was just that having the entire lake's evaporation put on just a small body of water was an issue. We were somewhat fortunate in that we had basically Goleta acting as the canary in the mine. with their deliveries in June, they delivered about 700 acre-feet of state water, and they lost about 200 acre-feet of that to evaporation in 1 month. So it was pretty significant. It was pretty eye-opening for the Bureau, and I think kind of galvanized the issue that, this isn't reasonable, it isn't sustainable. And so we've seen some progress. Apologize for this graphic, but this is something the county puts out, and I think it kind of helps discuss what's in the lake. We have this unallocated water. This is water that has come into the tunnel, Tecolote Tunnel, infiltrated in Tecolote Tunnel. It's considered project water. Along with any rainfall that falls on the lake, kind of goes into this unallocated water category, and it is being used to meet the evaporation on the lake currently. We expect that 800 acre-feet to be gone by the first part of August, at which the carryover water will take the hit then for the evaporation. And I mentioned, if you can see here, we have a little over 5,500 acre-feet remaining. 2,300 of that is the city. So we own a pretty significant chunk of that. This little blue stripe here was imported water. Most of that is Galitas. This is the downstream users' water, which they are releasing. And we anticipate during that release that they will earn another 1,000 acre-feet in probably inflow credits in this very complicated formula that they have. But so their goal is to reduce this to zero. That's their goal by mid-September. And then the minimum pool, which belongs to the Bureau.
Worst case scenario, it doesn't rain between now and this year. What happens to the downstream? Are they completely out of water at that point?
They would be completely out of water in the lake, but their groundwater storage would be full. Their groundwater, that's how they basically get all their water, by pumping their groundwater basins. Their releases recharge that groundwater. This release is not intended to go to the ocean. It will stop just shy of Lompoc. They've got this down to a science. They know exactly how much water to release to get it right to the groundwater basins they need, but without pushing it past.
So that amount of water would be used not just this year, but into that's their basically.
That's their last
worth of water or something?
Yes, that's their last hurrah. And so things can get pretty ugly for them next summer if we don't see some rainfall into the lake. They will continue to accumulate about 300 acre-feet a month, seems to be the inflows that they get every month. So by next year, they should have 2,000 to 3,000 acre-feet, but that's not enough to get water to the Lompoc groundwater basin. So it could get pretty scary pretty quickly next summer for the downstream users if we don't see some rainfall.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So this graphic in here kind of showing where we've declared our Stage 1 in February of 2014, Stage 2 in May of 2014, and Stage 3 in May of 2015. And then here you can see during the last drought where the miracle month of March came around, and yet here we continue with our path, and our next hope of seeing anything is somewhere out in this area. Hopefully this incident here will occur. We'd welcome that. But we are in uncharted territories, and effective September 30th, barring no rain between here and September 30th, this will officially be the new drought of record. And this is just great. I want to give credit to Bill Dewey. He's keeps sharing his wonderful photos that he takes of the status of the lake. And you can see right here over in this meadow is the intake tower. Here's where the barge was up until June 28th. And here is where the barge rests now in its new location. And you can see this piping here. There's about 9,000 feet of pipe now that leads over to our barge and is truly the lifeline, continuing to allow the movement of our carryover water and imported water to the south coast. Groundwater wells, as I'd mentioned, I think this is the first time I can say that all 8 wells are on and in production. We continue to monitor all seawater intrusion. At this point, we've seen no significant increase in chlorides at our monitoring wells since basically last summer. However, we do expect in the next round of monitoring that this will change by the end of the summer, given how much water we're extracting from the basin. At this time, I'm going to ask Linda Szymanski to come up and fill us in on the latest with the desal facility.
Madam Mayor and Council members, Linda Szymanski, Principal Engineer for the Engineering Department. Mr. Hagmark's asked me to give you an update on the Desal Project. I think we last met last January to talk about some contaminated soils. So this is what's been going on since that time. What I'd like to do is go over the current status and where we are, talk about some of the changed conditions that we've encountered, and talk about some of the things that we see potentially coming. Along with that, talk about the costs and some schedule impacts that we think that there may be, and then talk about some next steps. So right now, just to give you a current status, most of the equipment sits on a structural foundation. Most of those have been poured, and we are ready to start setting a lot of the equipment in place. We have completed a major portion of the underground utility work that includes both the piping and the electrical. We have actually received the treatment trains. They are on site. They are set. Right now what we're doing is connecting those. If you remember, they were modular, and so each train has a number of modules that the piping and the electrical needs to be connected for now that they've been set in place. We are still continuing to work on electrical. We have received the piece of equipment that is the main power source for the plant itself. It is set in place, and we are starting to do the wiring for that. We have received the switchgear, which basically is the piece of equipment that steps down the electricity that we receive from Southern California Edison to something that is more usable at the plant. We have received that. It is on site. The new transformer for Estero is actually on site. We are completing the foundation pads for that out in front of the Estero plant. And we anticipate that all of that will be set, and we will have most of the electrical wiring done by the end of August. Our offshore work actually was beginning today. This was the first day that the boat has gone out. We are doing discovery at this point. We have a number of permit conditions that we need to take care of first. And we also have a concrete box that's sitting out there that we need to look at, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that one later. Talk a little bit about some of the change conditions that have happened since we last talked in January. Talk a little bit more about contamination. Want to review a couple of electrical issues that we've had with you, and then lastly talk about, I think, which is probably our biggest issue at the moment, something called the transition pieces. So you may remember these pictures from our talk in January. This is the one on the left is actually the desal site. That was when we started actually digging the test pits so that we could actually determine the amount of contamination on site. The one on the right was a picture of some of the debris that we actually found as we were excavating in that area. This picture actually shows where we were as we were excavating at the end of April. And the reason that date is important is because we have actually settled with the contractor on contaminated soils costs through the end of April. So this is the point where we settled with them. If you look at the left-hand side of the picture over here, this has all been put back. Underneath here is electrical, and this is actually where the reverse osmosis units are now sitting. At that point in time, we were still working on underground piping. This is the piping that takes water to and from the skids. At that point, we were also working on the area where it's, all of the water, the backwash water, goes before it exits out to the ocean. So a good portion of our excavation had been done at that point. But there were still a few things that we actually had to do. These squares actually indicate not deep excavation, but actually foundations that still needed to be dug at that point in time. So these costs, the one for the digging inside of those red areas, were not captured in our settlement with the contractor at that point in time. In addition, because we've had to go to do some other different things at the plant, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, we have found some additional contaminated soils. One is during our trenching for the pump station electrical feed, and I will actually show you some slides about what that is. We also did find some in the Brine Box area. This box is where all of the brine mixes with the effluent from El Estero before it exits into the ocean. We actually did find contaminated soils there also. And one more place that we found contaminated soils, we are required to put in a bioswale over at our pump station area. We actually did test the area, and the spots that we had tested came back clean, so we did not anticipate that we were going to need to remove soils from there. However, when we started to dig further beyond those test sites, we actually did find contamination, so we will need to remove that from the site. So just to talk a little bit about electrical, this is actually the original plan of how the desal plant was going to be powered. So this is actually the SCE substation. It is right in front of the El Estero wastewater treatment plant. You've probably seen it as you've been driving by. What we were going to do was put in a new trench, which is designated by this green line, and connect to a new switchgear. We were then going to take power from that switchgear, which reduces the electrical to a rate that we can actually use at the plant, and connect it over to an existing box and then take it across the street to the plant. Then what we were going to also do is use an existing line, which is designated by this purple, to actually run the feed over to El Estero, because SCE actually feeds both the desal plant, El Estero, and it actually feeds the pump station for the desal plant. So we actually needed to reconnect El Estero. So that was our original plan. Where we actually are right now is with this plan. A number of things have happened. First off, we were not allowed to put the switchgear in this area. There are some overhead lines there. SCE does not allow you to actually put equipment underneath those overhead lines. So we did have to move it over to this area over here. So it actually changed our feed from SCE to a little bit longer run. We still had the same connection that we were going to take across to the desal plant. But one other wrinkle in this was that we were not allowed to use this purple line. It's actually not the city's. It actually belongs to SCE. They do not allow us to have both public and private wire and conduit inside in their facilities together. So we actually needed to take our stuff out, and what we've done is actually created trenching over to El Estero. So this orange line is actually new and is replacing this purple line. To help us,
Which is public and which is private? So that purple line was...
this purple line actually goes over to the SCE private air. They have a little area over here, and we can't actually take our stuff into their area and come back over to our transformer. So we couldn't actually put anything in that purple line and then come back, which is the way it is right now.
Today.
The purple line is being used today. It will go away once we energize.
So why are we able to use it today?
Because right now it is theirs. They are actually energizing from the SCE substation all the way over to the El Estero portion over here, because that is the only power that is in that area right now. So it actually belongs to SCE right now. What we were going to do was put in something that belongs to us. And okay. So we can't have both.
Because?
Together. That is an SCE regulation.
Because? Do you know why?
I don't know that I can answer that for you.
Okay. Did we get an answer besides that's just our rule from SCE?
This was actually negotiated. I guess part of this is that we're changing the way that the power is supplied in general. So instead of supplying the desal plant, El Estero, and the pump station, the city is going to take one feed. and then we are going to divvy up the power. It actually is a substantial savings in electrical costs for us. And so that was negotiated before the project actually started. So I don't know if that helps. So the way we're taking power changes. So the
Okay.
city is now...
But they knew that when you negotiated, right?
Correct.
So this was a decision that they just realized recently that was, I mean, I guess I'm trying to figure out the chronology event of why this was a sudden,
Yeah,
what
this
appears to be a sudden change and is
Right.
causing a delay, right?
We had believed that we could actually use that line. When we started the project, we believed we could actually use that line, and we anticipated that we would be able to use that purple area. As we got started with the project, that they told us that we would not be able to.
Okay. That's very frustrating, to say the least. I'm sure I'm not telling you something you don't already know. Mr. Dominguez, did you have a question?
Thank you. Does this add in any ability to consider solar power?
At this point in time, for the desal plant, we are not able to put solar power in. That is something I think that can probably be negotiated later. The other piece that we can't do actually is wheel power from the Estero site over to the desal plant. So I believe they're out there potentially in the future for negotiation.
I just wondered, it seems like we're going to invest in some infrastructure, and would we own these boxes? The orange boxes?
Correct. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, yes, we actually will own those orange boxes, so we will have the ability to affect those. What we won't be able to do is wheel power across the street from the Estero plant if we decided to do something there to get it across the street to the desal plant.
Madam Mayor, Jim Dewey, our facilities manager, has been working with SCE on this issue, primarily because of the fact that we do produce methane, and we do have a cogen facility where we do produce electricity. Right now, 30 to 40% of our power needs at Estero, and the question is if we continue to expand our operations there with maybe a third digester, the potential to start to produce even more gas, how can we leverage that to be used? Because seasonally, maybe we could push that across the street. And so he is working with SCE. Unfortunately, as you've probably been well aware, there are a lot of PUC regulations, and he's trying to work on that. But we've had several meetings, and he's working on that exact issue.
Is the issue because it's using SCE infrastructure to transport if we created more electricity from the methane gas? The methane gas came from all of us basically at Estero, but the way to get it to the desal plant is using SCE infrastructure, and that's causing the issue?
As I understand it, this design here will allow us to get around using any of SCE's infrastructure to wheel it. So I wish I had more information for you on that, but I know Jim has been working, and I can come back again and report on progress of that. But that's kind of why we're going through, I think, a lot of this turmoil with SCE. They're probably, I don't know if they're exactly happy with this, but we're ultimately going to take power and distribute it to our own facilities and basically have our own metering on our side, which ultimately is intended to allow us to wheel our own alternative energy across the street. Yeah.
Did you have more, Mr. Dominguez? Or okay, thanks. Okay, thanks. Keep going.
So one of the other issues that that's come up with us on the electrical side is actually powering the pump station. The pump station is actually located down in this area, kind of on the other side of the Estero plant. This is actually the desal site up in this area. The way this has been fed in the past is that from that same SCE substation that is located up in this area, there was electrical cable that was run along this blue line down to the pump station down in this area. What we found when we started doing some more discovery work is that this wire was not actually put in any conduit. It was actually buried directly in the ground. This is a 25-year-old wire. We did do testing on it to see what the remaining life of it was. Based on a theoretical table and the results that we received on testing, we had probably 5 years of life left on this. Understanding that this is a 20-year facility and that we didn't want to be taking this facility down sometime between 0 and 5 years when we started up, we decided that we actually needed to rerun the wire because we could not take it out and replace it. So we actually are putting new cabling in conduit in. We're actually going to use this purple route to bring it through the Estero plant. It is a slightly shorter route, but the thing that it does by us is not having to work in the ESHA or the ESHA boundary area. There is a small portion of it that is in the buffer area along the Laguna Channel here that actually would have required us to return to the Planning Commission to be able to work in that area. So we are going with this alternate route. And that work actually is in progress right now.
So that the unconduited line, is that a result of the contract that was, it was the previous desal plant was design build and quick, and so it was just kind of a proverbial slapdash piece of work that happened, and low cost. Was that kind of what we're talking about here?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, yes, we believe so. Our drawings, our record drawings actually do show conduit there. It's not unheard of to direct bury wire. I mean, it has been done in the past. It doesn't leave much for those who are coming after you to work with, but it is a cheaper way and a quicker way of completing work.
Okay, thank you.
One of the other areas that we are actually going to have to do some work on is the Brine Box area. This is the area where the effluent from Estero mixes with the brine from the desal before it actually exits out to the ocean. It's actually located down in this far corner of the Estero wastewater plant. What we were going to do is actually we need to do some more sample stations in this area because our discharge permit requires now that we actually take samples from the brine, from the effluent of the secondary, and also the combined of those two before they exit to the ocean. Right now, the way we're configured is that Estero are the only folks who are sampling because they're the only folks who are running. The way their sampling is set up is inside the box where everything mixes. Because we need to have a discrete sample from Estero by itself, we actually needed to move the sampling station away from that inside that box itself, somewhere outside of the box along the line for the effluent before it reaches this box. Our original intention was to actually just do that in this area, and actually this is the area where we would be taking the sample for the mixed effluent and brine. The thing that I don't think we realized when we first put the plan together was that all the work we wanted to do is actually within the ESHA buffer. There is a 50-foot buffer basically from the line of these trees along Laguna Channel. So we were not able to actually put anything in this area and trench. So what we have done is moved many of the facilities back to an area where they're not in that buffer, basically power and communication. We did actually go to Planning Commission. We did need to actually dig in the buffer area to get the sample for the combined effluent and the brine. So we did get that permission. There will be a very small amount of power and communication that runs out to the sampler in this manhole. We could have taken manual samples from there. However, with the electronics and the technology that we have today, it just makes more sense to put in something that does this automatically. So we felt that it was worth going forward and putting this in. The last piece that I want to talk about are what we call the transition pieces. And what happens with the electrical cable that actually powers the pump in the ocean is that it runs inside of the intake line, and it enters and exits a couple of times. So this is actually an aerial view of where the plant is, where the pump station is, and actually where the intake is out in the ocean. There are actually 4 of these transition pieces. The electrical conduit actually enters up at the pump station area, runs down underneath the railroad tracks and the park to a transition piece that's located basically in the ice plant area on the beach side of the bike path. The wire actually exits there, and then actually it enters back in at a basically concrete box on the beach. There is one of these transition pieces inside of that box, and then the wire runs again inside of the intake line until it reaches the pumps out in the ocean, where it exits and connects to the pumps. I think there were a couple of reasons this was done. Basically to help so that there didn't have to be more trenching than there needed to be. There really wasn't any other good way to get under the railroad. And so this was the solution that they came upon to be able to quickly get this whole thing in and wired. We've actually had a couple of incidences with these transition pieces. The picture on your right is a picture of the transition piece that's in the concrete box out on the beach. We did not realize that this was encased in concrete. It does not show on the plans that it was encased in concrete. There was actually about 5 feet of sand on top of this, so we actually had to dig the sand out of the box. When we did, we encountered a whole glob of concrete. We actually had to chip the concrete away from this transition piece. It turns out in the original project, when they were testing the line, they actually did damage this piece. The fix for that piece was to epoxy it and encase it in concrete so it wouldn't leak. So we know this piece is damaged, and we know we have to replace it. So when we discovered that, we actually started working with the contractor. We have identified someone who can make a transition piece for us. So we do have one transition piece to replace this one in the works. When we went to actually pressure test the rest of the line, there is another transition piece that is actually at the pump station area. This is the one that was referred to fondly as exploding in the newspaper. When we pressure tested it, the bolts actually did not hold when we pressure tested it. It's somewhat like having like a water main break or someone shear off a fire hydrant. You basically have that same release of pressure. And so what happened is this piece, the bolts did not hold on it. Unfortunately, about 3 of them did, and they took away this small piece right here. So we have actually damaged this transition piece also. It is a fiberglass type material. It's not very thick walled. And again, it was encased in concrete, we think, because they knew that this was a more fragile type of piece. So we actually are in the midst of ordering the piece to replace this one. It has given us concern about the other 2 transition pieces that are still out there. One is in the ocean, and the one is by the bike path. We will actually find out more about the one in the ocean now that we've started our marine work. It is in a concrete box out in the ocean. We can't see it right now. We actually need to have the divers go in and open that box before we can figure out what actually happened out there. So we're hoping that by the end of the week we will have a little bit more information on that one. When we actually haven't been able to get to the one that's on the beach by the bike path either. It's in an odd location. It is in the sand. We're going to need to dig fairly deep for it. One of the concerns that we have had is we do have grunion on the beach. We do have a buffer area that we cannot work in while the grunion are there. This particular transition piece is outside of that area. We believe that we can get to it. The other pieces, we also need to work with the Coastal Commission. This was not planned work on the beach, and so we are working with them on how we can do the work on the beach. One of their concerns is that if we open that up and we have to wait for a new piece to come, that it will be open for several months and impede access for the beach. So we're working with them on a plan to actually dig it up, fill it back in once we find it, and then we'll be able to actually dig it back up when we're ready to replace it. So that's all in progress right now, working on that. Down below are actually a couple of renderings of the new pieces that we're making. They are actually made out of HDPE, which is what these pieces connect to. The rest of the pipe is HDPE pipe. These will be much more robust. What they have on them is an area. This area is a special piece that's being made and gets welded onto a regular piece of HDPE pipe. These are actually being made overseas and shipped to us. They actually don't fabricate these types of things in the U.S. We don't really have the tooling for it. So we have an area right here where the conduits will actually enter and exit the pipe. If you look here, you can actually see kind of on the inside of the pipe where the conduits will come in and connect. And then the piece on top is actually something more like a place where we can go in and take a look at these things and actually see what's happening inside. So like I said, we have 2 that are on order and 2 that we have ordered the parts. However, we cannot really manufacture them at this point because they are made specifically to fit in a certain opening. And so until we can look at those other 2 pieces and see how big they need to be, we actually can't manufacture them. So those have been the woes of the past 6 months. We have had some good successes. We are making some very good progress on the plant. But just wanted to go over some of the change order costs with you. Our change order allowance, as you can see at the beginning of the project, and with the extra, this actually includes the extra services for the soils, was almost $5.7 million. Just as a reminder, last time we were here in January, we asked for $2.3 million for contaminated soils. So that is included in this number. Through April, as I had showed you on the previous slide, the work that we had done to date, actually our settlement with the contractor for that was just over $2 million. That actually includes some acceleration costs. We were able to buy back some time on the project. So rather than being a delay of 42 days, we actually managed to buy back about 14 days of that. So the work that we were doing for the power for the plant itself, if you remember the extra switchgear movement and the extra conduits, that was actually just under $650,000. The pump station power to reroute that through the Estero plant was just over $600,000. The Brine Box work was just over $550,000. And we did have some other small items basically dealing with communications of the plant itself to our plant at Cater and also for the pump station, just slightly over $250,000. So basically to date, we've used about $4.1 million of our $5.6. And our remaining change order is just over $1.5 million. Unfortunately, kind of based on where we are and what we see, the additional contaminated soils, which is basically what I showed you from beyond April, plus the things that we found as we're working through the Estero plant, we're anticipating about another $1.9 million in contaminated soils costs. The transition pieces themselves are actually very expensive. They are custom, and the installation of them is not easy either. We have had to, as I said, at the beach box, actually chip away to find that one. We did have to do some chipping at the pump station also. We honestly don't know what the one at the beach looks like by the bike path. We can only assume that we will have to chip at that one also to get at it. And quite honestly, the one in the ocean, we're not sure what it looks like. It's inside that concrete box. So knowing all of that, this comes at a fairly hefty price tag. We're anticipating probably $2.25 million. This actually includes some delay costs in it because we do believe that being able to get the transition pieces in will actually delay the project somewhat. We do have some other items that we've identified at this point that we are going to need to deal with. Some of that has to do with some chem piping and the chemical tanks. We were planning on reusing the chemical tanks. Some of them were actually in use. As we emptied them and took them out, we've realized that, again, these are old tanks, probably need to be refurbished or replaced at this point. We are working on how to go about doing that. It's starting to turn out that actually refurbishing a tank doesn't cost a whole lot less than a new tank, and it doesn't buy you the warranty that you get with a new tank. So we're still wrestling with that one and hope to have a decision on which way to go very shortly. A couple of other things. There was a sewer that was located at our pump station area. For some reason, that was abandoned, so we have to put that back. There are a few other small things like that actually add up to the $650,000. And, we're starting to get to the end of the project. Hopefully there's not a whole lot more to discover, but we actually do want to have a little bit in reserve at this point, so we're asking for $500,000 for things that haven't turned up yet. So basically, everything that we kind of see as coming up is about $5.3 million. We had about the $1.5 million left over. So we anticipate that we're probably going to need for the contract another almost getting close to $4 million for the contract for IDE. Just to kind of summarize on this one, the original IDE contract was $43 million. That does not take into account the original $1.3 million that we used for design for them. I think everybody will remember it cost more of $44 million. That includes the design piece. Our previous change orders and now what we're proposing for change order. Based on what we're seeing delay time-wise, we also believe that we're going to need to increase the contract with Carollo for more time, and then also we're going to need some more staff time on this. We actually didn't increase staff time when we came back on the contaminated soils, but I think at this point probably prudent for us to do it based on the fact that we do see delay. So these are actually the potential schedule impacts that we see. The original schedule actually had us completing the project on the 7th of October. With the contaminated soils delays, that actually moved to basically the beginning of November. What we're looking at time-wise now, and this is still our best guess at this point, and we still do have some information coming in. We are looking at a completion of the middle of January right now. The way this will work is our actual work itself is extended out until probably about the beginning of December. We'll start our pre-commissioning and startup, and that is pretty much getting the plant, make sure that everything's talking together, running correctly. And we'll attempt to do as much of that as we can prior, to a true hard startup. And then we'll do an acceptance test. That is something that is required in the contract. At the point of the acceptance test, we should be able to produce water. There is a good chance that while our completion is at the middle of January, if we're able to get the permits from the Department of Drinking Water, which we are working on right now so that they understand everything that we're doing, and we have our sampling done and everything is fine, they will actually give us a permit to put water into the system prior to the completion of the project. And that acceptance testing actually is going to probably start at the beginning of January, so there is potential to have water at the beginning of January. So our next steps, actually, the council agenda report for this is actually due to you next week. It will show up on your consent calendar, so we would ask you to accept the staff recommendations on that, which will be to increase the contract for IDE Carollo and to increase some funds for staff at that particular point in time.
I have a question from Mr. Hart.
Does the new schedule include time, contingency time for the additional transition pieces if they have to be reordered and replaced?
Matt, Council Member Hart, yes, they do. We've tried to estimate as best we can when we will actually get in to look at these pieces and how long they'll take to manufacture, and then also a time to actually install them.
So you've kind of assumed a worst case for having to do the work that you've had to do for the previous two in terms of the schedule.
Correct, we have.
And then the cost probably would be sort of orders of magnitude in addition to that as well, too. A couple $1 million more.
The cost that we have in here actually accounts for all four of the transition pieces and actually installing them. Okay. So we have tried to anticipate what the cost of that is.
Thank you.
Mr. Dominguez?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The additional contaminated soil, can you tell me a little bit more about that, how we found it? And
Sure. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez. A portion of it has to do the additional soils. Originally, when we were calculating how much we needed to take out of the plant, we were assuming that they would actually trench a certain way and that we would be able to, rather than digging straight and putting shoring in and doing all of that, we would be able to do a different type of shoring, which basically benches back your dirt or puts it at an angle that you don't need to put shoring in. It's an improved way of doing trenching and digging the large pits. We actually weren't able to do that because of the debris was in the soil. We weren't able to actually get anything that was stable. So rather than that benching, we actually had to dig some additional soil out so that we would basically have a square box rather than something that looked more like a diamond with a flat bottom. So that actually added to the additional soils. Several of the other pieces are things that we weren't planning on doing. The trenching that we're doing through Estero for the power cable to the pump station. We hadn't originally planned to do that. When we decided to do that, that whole area is contaminated soils that we need to deal with. The work that we were planning at the Brine Box, it was in a very small area. What we've actually doing now with kind of spreading everything back out of that ESHA buffer is actually contact more contaminated soils back in that area. And like I said, for the bioswale area that we were putting in the pump station, we actually tested it, came up clean, didn't think that we needed to actually remove those soils. And then when we did start digging, we were just incredibly lucky when we tested that nothing was dirty. Unfortunately, when we did start to dig, we did come up with contaminated soils. So that is extra stuff also.
so if the transition pieces, the two that we haven't looked at yet are damaged and need to be replaced, what would that impact the timeline?
We've actually tried to include that in this January, the middle of January completion date. We've tried to take the timing that we have for the first piece and extend that out to these other pieces, knowing that we and trying to assume some time when we will get to these other two pieces. So we've tried to build all of that into that schedule.
And is that in the potential schedule impact slide? Can we go back?
Sure. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, yes, the impacts of all four transition pieces, we've tried to build that into the potential schedule impacts.
So that'd be the bottom.
Based on the knowledge that we have so far. So that is the one with the completion date on the 23rd of January.
That's all identified in that big, long green bar with the title project work?
Yes, that is actually identified in that bar.
So in theory, if those two transition pieces are functional, that bar would then be reduced?
Correct. That bar would be reduced and everything would shift back to the left again. I would say that we're not incredibly optimistic based on our experience so far, but we will keep our fingers crossed.
And are you able to do any camera work down there, or put a pig or a plug in there? And
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, we've actually run a camera from the concrete box on the beach back towards the pump station area. Unfortunately, it tells us about the inside of the pipe, and it doesn't tell us a lot about the outside of the pipe and where the connection is with the conduit there. So we've learned a little bit, but not enough to really make a decision one way or the other. We won't be able to do that until we dig it up.
Oh, it didn't run into a plug of sand.
No.
But it doesn't show you that there's not a cap that's
Right.
cracked. Okay. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, Council, I'd like to just add to that our water supply planning was relatively conservative and assumed a startup date of December 1st. So the impacts to our supply planning are a little bit smaller. And we do have a meeting tomorrow with the president of IDE Americas and his staff to try and see what can be done to accelerate this workload and try and meet this timeline. I do want to note, because I certainly take on a lot of the ownership of getting this up and running, but need to remind everyone that this is a project that really should have taken 24 months or more to complete. We gave the contractor 12 months to do it. We are utilizing existing equipment that we had some information about, including contaminated soils. We had information showing that the site had been clean, at least in some of the areas that we knew we were going to, where we unfortunately hit stuff. But even with these delays, we're looking at a project with a 15 to 16 month completion versus what probably should be a 24 month. We are pushing this project as quick as we can, and it's unfortunate. But we need to keep it all in perspective as to what we are trying to pull off of here. Other Carlsbad project took 15 years to design and build that project, and we're doing this all in 2.5 years. It just is a lot. It is a lot that we've taken on, and it's unfortunate that we do have these delays and additional costs.
If I could ask one more question. So the final piece of the puzzle then is kind of the filtration systems, and is this we have, I think you mentioned reverse osmosis. Is that correct? Or no? What's the filtration system that the Desal plant's going to be using?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, yes, this is reverse osmosis.
And is there a two-stage filtration, or is it just the RO?
Actually, there is, in these areas right here, there is a pre-filtration. Reverse osmosis requires that the water be fairly clean before you put it through the reverse osmosis filters themselves. So there is kind of a pre-filter, and then these are actually the reverse osmosis units right there.
In a lot of ways, this is exactly like a surface water treatment plant. These filter units right here act just like we have at the Decatur water treatment plant. Basically, the intent is to pull out all the particulates in the water, and then all that remains then is salty water, which the RO membranes will then remove the solid molecules. So in many ways, it has a lot of similarities to what we have as a surface water supply.
No UV treatment?
It does have a final polished with UV treatment, though.
And what's IDE's track record in terms of this part of the facility? So this is all going to be brand new, so we don't have to depend on physics or chemistry to see what shape it's in. So what's your expectation? What's your due diligence showed you in terms of their ability to put that in the next 6 months?
It was one of the main reasons we found them to be the most qualified. This exact design has been replicated numerous times around the world for island communities and such. This is portable. You could build it somewhere and assemble it. So we do have a high level of confidence. It's already been put together at its manufacturing site. Everything was aligned and made sure it worked in general, and then it's basically being delivered here on site. So we do have a higher level of confidence than if it was just a bunch of pieces being brought from all over.
Thank you.
Mr. White?
Will future...
Mr. White.
excuse me, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So was the contract with IDE, was that for this work, and then the pipes and so forth going out to the ocean, that remained city responsibility? Was that how that was divvied up, or how did that work?
Yeah.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, actually IDE has the contract for everything. They actually are doing the work for the pipe that goes out to the ocean, the conduits, the pumps in the ocean, all of that, in addition to this piping and the work at the pump station.
So their contract, and as I recall, there was a penalty for not getting done on time. But is there, because the circumstances are extenuating, that penalty doesn't apply? Is that the?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember White, we're actually, yes, there was that in the contract. There were liquidated damages for not producing water on time. Unfortunately, I believe probably a good portion of this is a problem with an unforeseen circumstance that they wouldn't have been able to know about, and that does give them relief from liquidated damages. We will be looking at the schedule much closer to make sure that the correct amount of time is put towards things that were unforeseen and things that weren't.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Hart?
Will future expansion of the plant require trenching that potentially would get into contaminated soils, or is all the trenching necessary for those future phases done in this phase?
We will still have to do some trenching and digging, and it will have contaminated soils in future work. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. I think there's one more component to this, right?
That's right.
Board.
So as far as the water sales agreement with Montecito, we are currently continuing to work on just the reimbursement agreement. Montecito board did approve an agreement with some changes that we have some issues with, and we're continuing to work through those issues. Our goal is to try and make it back by the 9th before the council takes a recess, but that'll assume Montecito can live with the changes that we need to make to that agreement.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just real quickly. So the difference is the amount that you estimate we've incurred to date in costs versus what they... Is there a disagreement about the facts? Is there a disagreement about the percentage that each entity ought to pay of those costs?
Madam Member, Councilmember Hart, there seems to be a little confusion out there. We aren't looking for reimbursement for past costs. This is all costs going forward for negotiations. But what we put out there was what we believe to be the total cost to be able to reach a final agreement. And that means preliminary design work of the conveyance pipeline to get them this water. Without the conveyance pipeline, there is no way to guarantee delivery of this water. And so that funding agreement that I initially gave to them was just over $500,000, and it included the entire. They, at this time, are not comfortable paying for the preliminary design of the pipeline, and only want to pay for negotiations, which is about $193,000, covers like legal and some technical costs to negotiate with IDE for this expanded module that we're going to need. But at the end of the day, we're ultimately going to need to finish the preliminary design so that we have an understanding of the costs of that work and the magnitude of that work. If I come back on August 9th, I'm going to have it all in one, like the whole package, and then hopefully in the not-too-distant future, they will come around to the understanding that they need to get this work done and we can continue to move forward with the whole package. But they're kind of piecemealing something at the end of the day. We're not going to have all the information needed to successfully enter an agreement.
So on the 9th, you're going to ask for our approval of this part of the negotiation. Then you'll take it back to them at a future date?
It's not ideal, but yes, I'm going to basically say, here it is, here's what we can live with, because we've already given them something, they've altered it, we have edits to it. We're basically going to say our council's approved this, here. I think it's very reasonable. We're not, we're only asking for reimbursement of reasonable costs, and we're sharing some of the costs of negotiation. So I don't think it's out there. I did go and speak to their public meeting, and I thought it went very well, the discussion. In fact, the public seemed to understand and be very supportive of the reasonable costs of this. So,
thank you.
So recycle water.
Actually, I want to ask a question about that. That's unclear to me.
It's 4:45. We have an appeal, and we have, so I want to try to see if we can wrap things up. So if you can be concise in your question, that would be good.
Yeah, can you give me a little more background on the negotiation with Montecito? Because if it's going to come to us the last meeting before recess and we aren't able to resolve something, that just seems like we're cutting it a little short. And I don't know if now is not the time. Maybe we could have you come back next week and discuss just that issue.
I would just suggest the two of you speak after the meeting and get your questions answered.
I'd rather do it in open session.
I mean, I will be back if I can, but my goal, and again, we have our resources are spread very thin on so many fronts. Trying to get this back by August 9th is our goal. There isn't really anything dramatic or surprising in this. It's really a reimbursement agreement for them to reimburse the city for our costs in this negotiation. Certainly, if the council doesn't feel comfortable on August 9th, then it moves to September 6th, and that's just what it is. It's, I feel like we've done our best. We sent them back in May. We got this to them, and so it's been back and forth for a while. So, anyway.
If I'm the only one who has concerns, then I'll meet with them privately. But if other people want to do it in open session, we can invite them back next week. So I'll leave it up to the other council members.
Personally, I don't want to give any more. I don't want to have staff have any more time except for negotiating what they need to negotiate. And if we can say up or down it's just 2 weeks from now, and you have a lot of work to do between now and then. So, but I would suggest you just talk offline, unless anyone else really wants it. So, okay. Mr. Ward.
Well, just real quick, I wanted to give a recycled water status update. It is finally some more positive news. The plant is meeting demands without the use of potable water. We haven't used potable water, I think, since probably January, which is great. Demand has remained lower than normal due to the cooler weather, which we welcomed. We're working with the environmental group I think we mentioned before, who has expertise in membrane filtration. They have come up with some really great recommendations that we're working on, both short-term, and they have some long-term ideas as well. We are still testing those optimizations. Our plant production goal, as a reminder, is to hit 1.5 MGD because we think that's where we're going to be. Our demand's going to be somewhere in August and September. We have yet to turn on the Valverde well, which is a non-potable well, so we still have that standing by, ready to come online as well. At this time, there's not a need for any voluntary reductions in the recycled water system, although we have been working with our customers, Montecito Country Club. We've asked to stagger their planting, so they're pushing off a lot of their planting into the fall, which we really appreciate them moving that. But we will be back. Our goal is to be back, if not next week, by the 9th, with an amendment for the contract for professional services to keep that contractor working with us and our staff on optimization.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I'm going to go through these as quickly as possible. July is Smart Irrigation Month. It's a national campaign from the Irrigation Association, and we really like to target efficient watering practices and methods. I'm going to focus on one topic in particular, which is overwatering. It's estimated that as much as 50% of water used outdoors is wasted. For example, here in Santa Barbara, a typical landscape needs about 2 feet of irrigation water applied to it, and most people apply 5 feet. This graph shows in the blue a typical irrigation schedule from a sprinkler timer, and in the green, a correct watering based on plant water needs. So as the year goes on and the seasons change and the climate adjusts, plants' water needs change over time. So irrigation controllers are really not a set it and forget it type of device. They do need constant adjustment to be able to water efficiently and not overwater. This blue line actually shows a controller that's adjusted twice a year, but many controllers are never touched at all, and they're watering at 100% of summer peak demands. So here in Santa Barbara, plant needs in January are very different from June gloom and from about mid-August. So it does change over time, and it's July, it's getting to be about that peak time. So how do you water based on the weather? We try to make it as simple as possible. If you look on your controller, you should see something that says water budget or percent or seasonal adjust. And we post a value on our website every week that says what you should water to based on the local weather. It's called the watering percent adjust. Here it is on the website. And we also use Twitter to post it every single week. It's based on evapotranspiration data from local weather stations. We recommend adjusting weekly for maximum savings or at least monthly. And the city's here to help. If you don't like numbers, if you don't like touching your controller, we can do a free water checkup for homes or businesses. We also have a great video that explains all of it, as well as a few other irrigation videos. And we also rebate on smart irrigation controllers that adjust themselves based on the weather. And we're here for any last questions.
Madam Mayor, I have one more item I wanted to add. That's the role of Water Commission. We have a little bit of a challenge. Water Commission serves at the pleasure of the council to advise and make recommendations. And unfortunately, we've had numerous sensitive items that come up with desal updates, rate discussions. And I'm currently working with the city administrator and the city attorney to try and come up with some solutions so that we respect the role of the Water Commission, but also the sensitive matters that the council may be interested in. So we're going to be working on that.
Great. And Mr. White, are you the council liaison to the Water Commission? Maybe you can loop him in. I think that would make sense to loop Mr. White in as the liaison. Yeah. We do have a public comment speaker. Why don't we bring Mr. Burke up, and then Mr. Dominguez, you can go after that. Good afternoon.
Madam Mayor, members. We come from dust, we return to dust. We Homo sapiens spend much of our time figuring out how to use nature for our own use, and not much time appreciating nature for its own sake. This drought gives us the opportunity to realize we are not egocentric masters of the universe, but share a spiritual bond with nature. Our fates are commingled. We are not separate from, but a part of nature. While we want to pursue remedies, hopefully we take this opportunity to receive the education that nature has given us. Hopefully we will become better people because of this experience. Gratitude, not domination. Reverence, not arrogance. Serenity, not fear. Members.
Thank you. Mr. Dominguez?
That's a perfect segue to a comment I want to make here in a second, but I do have one more question for Josh about slide 9. And you said something about a peaking shortage and not enough water to meet demand, so I just wanted to get further information on that.
Yes. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, we do plan to come back in September and get into this in more detail, but basically we will be importing water to the lake all winter and building up what I call a war chest of water that is intended to help us meet all those peak demands next summer. Based on our delivery schedule, we do not believe we'll be able to build up enough water in Cachuma to help to meet all those peak demands next summer. We are currently looking at several hundred acre feet is what we're talking about for next summer, but it is a peaking thing. It is something that short term, I mean, we're going to need to meet that, and then we going back into the fall, we should have adequate water to meet demands. And so it is an unusual circumstance, and I believe we can put together several options that we can discuss and kick around. Certainly a little rainfall this winter would make it all go away. It doesn't take much at that point, but it'll be those kind of factors along with maybe we can take a look at regulations. Even the rates going into effect for FY17 could have that incremental conservation needed to get us through next summer. So lots of factors.
So several hundred acre feet. So what percentage does that end up being?
I don't know, 2-3%, something like that. Yeah, it's pretty small. It the discussion of whether development restrictions wouldn't address this type of concern. This is very different. Development restrictions would impact stuff 3 to 5 years out probably, and this is kind of a short-term situation.
And when you say development restrictions, you're talking about building here in the city?
Yeah, moratorium.
And is that because the water use during construction is minimal?
It is minimal, and typically the projects we're talking about are 2 to 3 years out. I mean, if a project already has a building permit, that's we're not going to stop that one. But if it's in the process, it's probably several years out before that demand actually comes online.
And regarding the rainfall, is it still too early to have prognostications about next seasons?
They're all over the place. They seem to be backing away from the La Nina, which I think I said before. La Nina would be an improvement from what we've been seeing.
Anything would be.
Right, pretty much. So they're all over the place. I give no weight on it at this point. It certainly feels like more of a normal summer in the sense of having the fog and cooler weather. We haven't seen that for like 4 years. Hopeful that means the return of some normal weather patterns, but we certainly aren't putting our eggs in that basket, making that the base of our plan.
If we had a normal rainfall, kind of normal over a 50-year span, would that address the shortage, the 2 to 3% shortage? Several hundred?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, and then the comment I wanted to make was just in relationship to development. And there was a planning commission hearing on Thursday, and they talked a lot about the AUD. And there's a presentation that was made, and some of the suggestions they made were really good. Obviously, the demand for water comes from, in a city like Santa Barbara, the number of people living here and then the usage that they partake. And part of the reason that the AUD was so successful was because of economic conditions that were taking place when it was developed. A lot of those reasons have changed. The environment, the economy has been on a 5-year steady improvement. The building climate statewide has improved, so there's a lot of things that are taking place. One of the most interesting developments from the presentation from staff was that several of the projects that are online are not actually going to provide workforce housing based on the monetary definition. So at some point in time, I know we've talked about it, there were some comments today. There have been some comments from the planning commissioners themselves. So at some point, I think it's worth revisiting and probably sooner rather than later, especially if we're going to end up with more dire straits in the water situation.
Mr. Hart?
Yeah, just the next time you come back, if you could touch on some of the regional water issues, the governance issues that are, broiling around us. And I don't know if that's time sensitive and if you're got too much going on in September, that doesn't work. But just at some point, I think we need to all kind of be engaged on that a little bit. And then if you could have Mr. Dewey come back at some point in the future and talk a little bit about the renewable energy options for the desal plant and how what he's trying to accomplish, that'd be helpful too. We had the president of Edison was here this week, and they sounded like they were cooperative and trying to be cooperative, and it'd be nice to know what the actual experiences Mr. Dewey's having with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that item, especially if you're doing this extra work now, we want to make sure in the future whatever we can do on renewable energy to offset the high cost of producing desalinated water, we can do if we're taking the time to do these trenches and other routes. I'm sure that's what Mr. Dewey's already looking at, but it'd be helpful to us as we're explaining things into the public about what's happening, because that's honestly one of the top questions I get about desal, besides when is it going to be ready, which is, are you thinking about other forms of alternate energy use in producing the water? And my answer so far has been, well, it's 40% less than it was 25 years ago, but I know there's more that we've been talking about or thinking about, and that would be good to know what those options are, because we may want to look into that in more concrete ways in the future. So that would be good. Any other comments? Okay. Well, this doesn't need a motion or anything. So thank you. We know you're doing everything you can to get this online as soon as we can. And just as a reminder for people, a normal water year means we still need desal into the future because we are so dry. So, okay. And we can hope for a good water year. All right. So item number 16.
Appeal